You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
Sabah al-Khair, good morning dear listeners. You're listening to Radio 3CR on 855 AM and Palestine Remembered with Robert Martin, Nasser Mashni and Yousef Alreemawi.
Palestine Remembered is Australia's only English language radio program that is totally dedicated to Palestine. We'd like to welcome those listening on 855 and those that will join us on podcast at 3cr.org.au.
Thanks for joining us. Stay with us and enjoy the episode.
Bringing you the news and views and the untold side of the Palestinian struggle for freedom from a Palestinian perspective.
Good morning, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Palestine Remembered. Almost 10 months into this genocide, and it still continues. This week, I've got part one of a lecture series that Yousef is doing on the history of Palestine. Stay tuned and listen to Yousef Alreemawi.
In May 1995, Gaddafi of Libya decided to deport 30 Palestinians from Libya with no explanation. And because the number was finite, 30 people, it didn't make it to news too soon. Now we can remember and recall and trace back and start from there. But when it happened, it was not the beginning of the story because they went unnoticed. That's May 95. And then in September 95, which is the anniversary of the revolution, which is the coup that brought him to power. Of course, if the coup works, then you call it revolution. If it doesn't work, then it's an act of treason. So September 95, there was thousands of more Palestinians from Libya being deported, this time on a big ship. And sailing from Tripoli and Benghazi all the way to Lebanon. Now Lebanon found itself with a reality that there are ships carrying more than 1,000 Palestinians from Libya. I don't know the exact figure, so let's call roughly, we'll say 1,500 Palestinians from Libya in boats, in ships, approaching the shores of Lebanon. And Lebanon, of course, a country that has just been out of a civil war, and there is a demographic issue. And one thing they will feel sensitive towards is accepting more Palestinians because they already have 350,000 back then. So they were not allowed to leave the boat. And for days and weeks, nobody knew what to deal with this situation. And the Lebanese authorities said, we will only accept the ones who hold Palestinian Lebanese travel document. And we will talk in depth about the travel document and the difference between a travel document and a passport. You can call it a para passport. And maybe down the track we might talk about the glossary of Arabic terms that made it into English from the Palestinian context. And one of the terms is wathiqa. Wathiqa in Arabic language is the Arabic word for document. So Lebanon said, we will only accept the ones who have travel documents, Lebanese travel documents. And that's 450 of the 1,600 people. And then the remaining were held Jordanian passports, like myself before I migrated to Australia, and they were allowed to go to Jordan, but not the ones who were married to non-Jordanians. So see, it's a little bit, there is a little bit of a situation that only Palestinians will understand for a simple reason that we lived it. We understood it because we learned the hard way. And the hard way is to actually live the limitation of these things of what sounds like an administrative or a legal paralysis, but it affects your life. So if you are a man, if you are a male holder of a Jordanian passport, then you can go to Jordan with your non-Jordanian spouse and children. But if you are a female holder of a Jordanian passport, then only you are allowed to go to Jordan, but not your spouse. When it comes to the nationality or the citizenship of their passports, basically, women and men are not on equal footing. And therefore, some women who held Jordanian passports on that ship remained with their family because their spouses and children did not hold Jordanian passports. And so you have the Palestinian Lebanese travel documents, you have the Jordanian passports, and then you have other travel documents. That's Palestinian Syrian, Palestinian Iraqi, Palestinian Egyptian. And Egypt did not accept any of them to enter Egypt. So we started a situation where nobody wants these 1,500 Palestinians. And then Egypt said, okay, at least we give them permission to go from the Suez Canal to Yambo, to the Red Sea, but still on the ship. And then we started hearing anti-Palestinian statements, like from one of the members of the Lebanese government who said, we don't want more human waste, as in referring to that trash, like the human trash, referring to Palestinian, more Palestinians. Like really black and white type of anti-Palestinian racism. And then Gaddafi, when the thing became an issue of public opinion, then Gaddafi said, okay, they can come back to Libya, but they have 6 months to find themselves somewhere to go because I'm getting rid of all the Palestinians. And his context, his rationale, why did he rationalize his decision? Follow Oslo. Now, you want to do Oslo? Go to Arafat. Let Arafat handle this, you know. If you started what later now we know of 30 years of nothingness of Oslo. So one of the ways of punishing the Palestinian leadership is to put pressure on Arafat, on PLO, using what? The people. And again, they had 6 months to find themselves a place. And some of them managed to find a place, but the majority did not. And then they got stuck on the border between Libya and Egypt. There is a border city called Marsa Matruh in Egypt and Saloum in Libya. And it's like desert. And they stayed in the desert camp. And that is when back then I was 20.
What's your email address?
That's a joke. The context of this is an Arab man is asking an Arab woman, how old are you? And she said, oh, how dare you ask? You know how it's very inappropriate to ask a lady about her age? And he said, I'm sorry, what's your email address? And she said, susu1984 at hotmail.com. So back to the story. So I was 20, and then my friend said, my auntie is one of them. The sister of my mother, my maternal auntie, Jordanian, married to holder of Palestinian Egyptian travel document, and they are in the desert. And they've been there for 6 months. Libya, and the guy, the Palestinian husband, the holder of Egyptian travel document, was an academic. He was a lecturer in a university. So it wasn't like, they were getting rid of those who were outlaws or they have bad records. No, they were like really achievers. And down the story, after 8 months of statelessness, makeshift desert camp, they heard that one of the African countries sells its nationality legally, not like a black market. You pay, you get a passport for $6,000 per passport. That was Mozambique. And then they asked, if you hold a Mozambique passport, can you enter Jordan? And Jordan said, yeah, no problem. There's nothing against the Mozambique people. So, in fact, we've never had anyone from this country up until 95. So they bought 1 for the father and 3 for the kids. So that's $24,000 US of their savings gone. And then they went to Jordan. And then the Jordanian, when there was a little bit of a scene at the airport, the guy had used the computer at airports back then. And then they clicked Mozambique and nothing came up. And they said, wow, you are the very first Ahlan wa sahlan. Welcome. We are honored. We are so happy. Let me call my boss. Sir, we've got people from a country that they've never come to Jordan. And there was a little bit of a... And then they probably had assumed that they are of, because there is a Lebanese migrant community in Africa. So in Africa and in South America, there's like a big Lebanese and Syrian community. So they had probably assumed that they were third or fourth generation of Lebanese descent, and then they go like, don't say you're Palestinian, don't mention Palestine. Like, hi, and then somebody took a picture, Why I wanted to start with this is that there is a price for not having a state. There are hundreds of stories like this. If we don't have a state, of course there's a political, we can talk politics, of course we can talk economy, but there is a humanitarian price. And it keeps repeating itself. And it's been happening since Nakba. And I am lucky to be one of very few people to have dedicated 15 years of my life trying to trace what happens to Palestinian refugees when they become refugees again. So if you become a refugee anyway, it's terrible. Because of civil war, because of tension, because of violence, because of sectarianism. Currently, as we speak, there are more than, if you open the website of UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, I think they have like a figure on their website. There's like more than 15 million people around the world who were refugees. And sometimes that does not even include the internally displaced. So within that, it's terrible when you are a refugee. But what happens when your refugee journey is no longer transitional? Like, for example, in the last 3 decades, let's start from 1993. We've got the Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, Yugoslavian civil war that resulted in what? In waves of refugees and internally displaced and violence, yeah? But at the moment, it's been finalized somehow by resettlement in third country or transitional country or returning back to where they are from. We also had tensions in many other countries in the world. What happens with Palestinian refugee problem is that the problem was born in 48 because of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, but for a reason, just because it's Israel, we became a constant, not a variable. We became a constant in an ocean filled with variables. Things change, but we are still refugees. I mean, I don't know if I mentioned that in, I think, talk 3, when I attended the talk of the head of UNRWA when they visited Australia in 2015. And they visited Australia because Australia back then did not pay its commitment to UNRWA. To UNRWA, not to the Palestinians. And the guy had to come here and talk to the Australian government, please pay what you said you will pay. And he started the speech by saying, we were born just a year after Nakba, but we have nothing to celebrate. And he said, since then, can you think of whatever events that happened regionally or globally that in your reading, in your memory, and then people started mentioning things in the 50s, something like the Korean War. Towards the end of the 50s, the Cuban, you have Fidel Castro, and then you have the early 60s tension that could have led to a nuclear war. And then, of course, Vietnam. Of course, we can talk and then mention the Beatles and like major things. All that happened when Palestinians are still refugees. So it's not like when we say that the Palestinian issue is not resolved yet, and we now, as we speak, we are at the highest peak of violence against our people. Highest peak of violence. Not even in the Nakba that we have witnessed this sheer level of violence against us in such a confined and small part of Palestine, which is Gaza, for nearly 9 months now. You've seen footage, you've seen pictures, you've seen images, you've heard stories. I know a family, in 9 months, they were displaced 10 times. 10 times. Because there's every corner, something happens, if not this week, the week after.
Stay locked to 3CR.
So the state, all of that is just a beginning of why do we need a state. Now, I'm going to divide today's lecture into two parts, after Nakba and before Nakba, our endeavors to establish a state. I would start with what happened after Nakba. The partitioning of Palestine. After 30 years of the British project in Palestine that started by the occupation of Palestine, or the occupation of Jerusalem towards the end of 1917, and then within a year they had occupied all of Palestine. So from end of 17 to end of 19, all of Palestine was under the military, not yet political, the military rule of British forces. Now the Palestinians realized that there was World War I ended, that the Turkish Empire is no longer ruling Palestine, and now we have foreign European forces in Palestine. And of course we'll talk about how they responded and how they joined the Kingdom of Arab Syria. But after 30 years of that, the mandate felt that the Zionists can have a state now. They are ready to have a state. But how do you do that? And they said, let's refer the Palestine question to the United Nations. Back then, the United Nations was a newborn because it was the League of Nations after World War I, and then after World War II, it became the United Nations. Let's refer the Palestinian question to the United Nations. And then what's interesting is I want to take the Soviet approach. Back then, the representative of the Soviet Union was Andrei Gromyko. You may have heard of Andrei Gromyko. Andrei Gromyko probably was one of the longest serving foreign ministers in the 20th century, from 50-something to 85. He was the foreign minister of the Soviet Union. But in 47, he was the Soviet representative to the United Nations. And in May 47, even though that the left, communism, socialism, sounds like anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, but when it came to Palestine, it was a little bit soft in colonization of Palestine. And then came the question, why? Why do you think when it comes to Palestine, all of a sudden, the capital, the hub of the left is no longer adhering to the values of the left? Why do you think? Guilt, thank you, one of them. Guilt is one of them. Because the pogroms happened in what later became the Soviet Union towards the end of the 19th century. Pogrom is the massacres against the Jews in East Europe, and mainly in what later became the Soviet Union. Zionism, the founders of Zionism, secular movement, not religious Zionism, they were left-leaning. The idea of kibbutz. So it's like socialists. There was like a little bit of left-leaning. Within Zionism, there was a little bit of socialistic or left-leaning ideology and the idea of kibbutz and communal places and sharing resources. So it sounded appealing to the left in general, and it could have been a bit of an illusion. Yeah? So all of a sudden, they did not adhere to the values of anti-imperialism and anti-colonial. And Gromyko said we have 4 scenarios when it comes to the Palestine question. Scenario 1, binational state. Binational state where Arabs and Jews live together, and it's not possible because of the hostilities, because of the animosity, and because of also that they knew that the Zionists did not want that. Scenario 2 is all Arab Palestine, and the Jews will remain there, but under an Arab rule. And I would say it would have been possible because had the migrants of Jewish background from Europe, had they taken the Armenian model, for example, because Palestine was home for non-Palestinians, non-Muslim, there's a room for everybody. Think of the Armenian Palestinians who fled the same, talking about pogroms in East Europe. Let's talk about the Armenian genocide then. So violence here and violence here. The Circassians, we were talking about this Sharkas, Central Asian, Today it's called Chechnya and Dagestan and Ingushetia. There was the Russian Tsar and the Chechnyan War in the 19th century that resulted in a genocide, that resulted in an exodus of the Cherkess into the Muslim world, including Palestine, including Jordan, including Syria and Egypt. And if you look up the bodyguards of the current king of Jordan and his father and his grandfather, they are still wearing the traditional costumes of the Circassians. So there was like a little bit of an alliance between a Cherkess, allow me to use their Arabic name, Cherkess, and the monarchy. The monarchy who had come to Jordan from the holy sites of Saudi Arabia, basically the Muslim world, Mecca and Medina and Ta'if and Jeddah, to Jordan. And then they found in Jordan also these fierce fighters. So there was an alliance. And then they became the bodyguards. So had the Jews from Europe taken the model of Armenians and Circassians, everybody would have been happy. But instead, what did they take? The journey of Zionism, which imposes and calls for Jewish supremacy. The problem is supremacy, not the faith. We don't have a problem. It's not like by definition you are of Jewish background and therefore I don't like you. Because if you don't believe me, think of how Iraqis and Egyptians and Palestinians and Lebanese and Syrians and North Africans and Iranians, treated their Jewish population. There was no question whatsoever. So, again, scenario A, binational state, not possible. Scenario 2, an Arab state, not possible. Scenario 3, Jewish state, where all Palestine is controlled by Zionism, or a Jewish state, not possible. And then came the idea of what? Partitioning. So partitioning was born in the context of these other three scenarios are not possible. So let's think of dividing. And then came a committee of 11 countries visiting Palestine, including Australia. Australia was one of the 11 members of that committee that visited Palestine after May 47. We're still in 47, yeah? Visited Palestine. And then gave recommendation. Yes, let's do a partitioning of Palestine. And then let's set up a date to do the voting. And again, this voting was General Assembly, not Security Council. General Assembly. So all countries will vote, not the Security Council. The date was in November 47. Initially, it was 24th of November. But then Truman, the Americans, realized that if the voting took place tomorrow, it's not going to go through. We don't have enough 2/3 yes to pass that. And then they pushed it from 24th of November to 29th of November. In these 5 days, many things happened. Exploitation, blackmailing, bribery, pressure, threat, you just name it, against the countries that have representatives that will do the voting, and especially the weak countries like Liberia and Philippines, and the Americans really came with their very, very strong might, to change the dynamic of the voting. 29th of November 1947, the voting, and then 33 countries voted yes, 13 countries voted no, 10 abstained, and 1 didn't turn up. And that meant that the resolution went through. So that was the voting on the partitioning of Palestine of 29th of November 1947.
That was Yousef speaking recently on the history of Palestine. Parts 2 and 3 coming up soon. Thanks for listening. Tell your friends, share the podcast, get along to a rally, and remember, there's never been a better time for a free Palestine.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast. If you found it valuable, please consider donating or subscribing to support independent community radio. To find out more, go to 3cr.org.au.